brains about at the end of the presentation, but that is timing. Is something I've run against. But anyway, so our restoration work is just to inform a larger restoration. It's just experimentation. So I apologize to those that have seen this previously, but I'll just recap our restoration experiment, which we deployed in 2021. So what I was looking at is whether the current approach of applying sort of a thin layer of material, which is a more traditional approach, is what's been done historically to top up what has been lost from existing reefs, is still an appropriate approach, given that we're looking at severely depleted reef systems. So I was trying to increase the height to see if that made a difference. Now, the literature shows that 30 centimeters, now this was in the Chesapeake, which is a little bit different from our system, that 30 centimeters was their optimal reef height when they were doing small scale experimentation. So that's where we started. So the reefs were 10 meters by 10 meters by 30 centimeters, or 0.3 of a meter. And that's 39 cubic meters of material per reef. We were looking at 3 different materials: natural shell, which is kind of the gold standard and traditional, has been used. It's good for spat settlement. It can be harvested, but it's not very readily available in large volumes these days. And it's also quite light and gets blown around and dispersed, and it also degrades relatively quickly. So the small lime rock is material that has been used in recent restoration efforts since 2015 in Apalachicola Bay and elsewhere. It can create mounds. It's not, it's more stable than shell. And it creates these small spaces. It's small material, it's regularly shaped, and it creates small spaces, but it can be harvested. So, you know, the question is whether it's habitat provision, how good that is, and it can be harvested with tongs, right? And then I wanted to go up a size to this larger lime rock or limestone to create a stable structure that wouldn't be influenced, you know, impacted and blown around by tides and currents, which are significant in Appalachia. It has these spaces, these nooks and crannies, which could be good for habitat provision. And it can actually still be harvested with tongs. It's tricky, but it can be done, as we've shown. So those were the 3 treatments. We have 5 replicates and 2 sites. So one was over on Dry Bar, to the northern part of Dry Bar, and then the other was Peanut Ridge. So you can see the layout there. Peanut Ridge is a little bit awkwardly shaped, so the layout wasn't as regular and nice as it was in Dry Bar, but that's how we deployed it. The sampling of our restoration experiments, if anybody's dived in Apalachicola Bay, this is kind of what you see. So we actually did a tong sampling, and then we did a scuba sampling so that we could get density measurements, and which is kind of the standard approach that Florida DEP and FWC use. And this is just a picture of one of the clumps that came up on our large lime rock, and that's a diver there collecting our large lime rock. You can see it's not huge. It's about between, 6 to 8 inches across and irregularly shaped. So we did 5 of these 0.25 meter square quadrats per reef, and we took the volume. We took the volume and counted and measured the live oysters and boxes, not just categorized them, but actually measured them so that we could get the demographics. So this is just some of our data, 14 months post-deployment. So the top panel shows oysters per meter squared. Now, a lot of these were small, and you can see the shell, the small limestone, and the large limestone for Dry Bar, and then Peanut Ridge, so West Bay, East Bay. And you can see that the small limestone has significantly higher numbers of oysters per meter squared, and not as high as the Peanut Ridge sites. And still the small limestone is kind of winning the race for the number of oysters per meter squared. So if you go to survivorship, though, the Dry Bar, none of the materials show any difference. And none of the materials show any difference on the Peanut Ridge sites either, but they are significantly higher than Dry Bar. But you can see that there is even though it's not significant because of the variance, there is the large limestone is inching ahead here. It's almost significant, the 0.07 difference. So it's kind of not quite there yet, but we're starting to see better survivorship on the large limestone than on the other materials. And then this violin plot, which I think is kind of cute. It looks like little infernal tardigrades or something, but these are quite interesting. So this is looking at shell height, or yeah, shell height of live oysters. And again, the west side versus the east side. And what this shows is that the small limestone does really well at spat settlement. So these black lines here are the spat size, 25 millimeters, and the legal size, which is 76 millimeters up there. So the small limestone does really well at encouraging spat settlement, and so does shell. Large limestone, not so much. But where the large limestone really prevails is in survivorship. And this is where we've had problems in the restoration work so far, is that we get good spat settlement, but they don't make it through. We don't get the market sizes coming through. And these data, which are on our restoration reefs, not the larger areas that have been fished, which is an artifact, these were put out last year, and this is kind of 14-month data. So again, these, as far as we know, these haven't been messed with. So we are seeing this difference in response to the larger limestone. And also, this is kind of anecdotal, from diving, but we're seeing more of the animals, the fishes and little crabs, in the large limestone reefs than we do in the small limestone and the shell. We're also seeing greater stability in that larger material. Okay, so I think that's all I was going to say about that. Oh, yes, so the red dashes are the 25, 50, 75, and 95% quartiles of predicted shell height from modeling these data. So if you look again at the different materials, let's say Peanut Ridge, you'll see that the predicted 95% quartile for the large limestone is much higher. It's in that sort of larger juvenile, or whatever we're calling them, sublegals. Whereas the small limestone and the shell kind of bottom out just above that spat size. So again, this sort of indicates that the large limestone is doing a better job for us. So the experiment that I planned for this fall, which is rapidly getting consumed by time, is it's hopefully going to, well, the plan is to use our data that we didn't have in a mature state last year and to really apply it to where we were going to put our materials and what materials we were going to use. So this is a graphic of the current speed model that our modelers have been running, hydrodynamic model. And one of the lessons learned from last year was that the middle of the eastern part of the bay has horrendous currents, and our shell and small limestone materials were dispersed and sort of spread out and blown out fairly quickly. So we wanted to find a place that had better current speeds, that even though the larger limestone was more stable, it was still being sort of blown out a little bit. So I wanted an area that had more sort of user-friendly current speeds, but that was still good enough to, obviously, they're oysters, they need currents, so we don't want somewhere quiescent. So basically what this graphic shows at these 95% quartile current speeds here at Peanut Ridge, which is where our experiments were, you get some really screaming currents up by almost 2 knots. Whereas Cap Point has much more manageable currents, around 1/2 knot to 3/4 of a knot. So this is where we're sort of leaning towards, is going for our next deployment, is Cap Point, based on this information only. Looking at the salinity, we want an area that is still going to have reasonable salinity during the dry periods, but not be too high during the wet periods. So we have here wet years, normal year, and a dry year. So 98, 2019, 2012, those are the years that have been modeled. And what you see here are the outputs for the 25, the median, which is 50, and the 75% percentiles. So if we look at the dry year, so normal years, sort of, there's a lot of places in the bay that might be good for, restoration. But if we look at the extremes, the dry year, that place over at Cap Point and actually over by Dry Bar still has reasonable salinity values. So we're looking for the sweet spot of around between 10 and 25 ppt. So this kind of northern part of the bay here by Cap Point, and actually most of the eastern part of the bay looks good, and the northern part of Dry Bar. If we go, and now this is surface salinity, so of course freshwater floats. If you go to a wet year, then you're potentially in trouble. But if you go to the median salinity, it still looks very wet, very fresh. But again, this is the surface salinity, and the Livingston's papers and actually the hydrodynamic modeling also shows that this saltwater intrusion from the eastern part of the bay, St. George Sound, comes in as a bottom layer around this Cap Point area. And this is why it's sort of traditionally been, or one of the reasons it's traditionally been a good area for oysters, because it maintains a reasonable salinity even when, even in dry and very wet years. Okay. So again, sort of leaning towards Cap Point, but the salinity shows that there are more options apart from that. So we also wanted to pick areas that were close to other restored areas, and this rationale is based on some papers that show that oyster recruitment is better when you have other oysters close by, whether that's a hydrodynamic issue or an oyster preference issue. That's what the literature shows. And so this is a map of the previously restored areas by CPAP, which are the restore areas, and the NERT in pink, and the NERDA areas are in blue. And then there's some FWC areas that actually aren't marked on here. But again, this Cap Point area is quite close to other restored areas, and it's also close to our other restoration efforts, so they will be comparable. Again, we could have picked somewhere over by Dry Bar, but given the data that we've seen from our restoration experiments and also from the broader tonging surveys that we've done and the other data, Dry Bar is not doing as well, just generally speaking, as the eastern part of the bay. So we've sort of decided to focus on that area. And part of that rationale is simply cost and logistics. It's mostly cost, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's leaning towards Cap Point there. This is our subtidal monitoring. I probably should have put this ahead of, when I was talking about where we were going, but you can see this is from 21-22, and it's really grim. The western side of the bay has pretty much no oysters anywhere. This is worse than our previous year in 2021, and we've been hearing stories, and actually the people have been posting on Facebook that they've been poaching over by 9 Mile, at least over by 9 Mile. So we know there's some poaching activity in the bay, but the western part of the bay is looking really sad. There are some bright spots over in the eastern part of the bay. And again, the darker green are the better areas. And so, just to reiterate what I said on the previous slide, we're picking areas that look good for oyster survival, i.e. those places where oysters have proven that they can survive. I also wanted to put another site down at the southern part of the eastern part of the bay, but the problem there was just logistics. There's really nowhere to deploy from on St. George Island, or at least we haven't found anywhere that would work really well. So that's kind of a placeholder for the future, is to have a site down here, either down by a hotel or East Cove. But for now, we're focusing on the northern part of the bay, which is easier to deploy the oystermen from East Point. Okay, so our experiment I was hoping to be this fall. So we're looking at, so the hypothesis is that whatever oyster metric we choose to look at, oyster demographics or what other number of different metrics, filtration, pathogen removal, whatever, will have benefits from increasing reef height, but it will reach an asymptote. So again, this is just a working hypothesis. But that the cost in terms of the number of acres that you can restore per $1 million will decrease with reef height. And I actually did the calculations with a number of different reef heights, 10, 20, 30 centimeters up to 60 centimeters, which is about 2 feet. 60 centimeters, about 2 feet. So based on the quotes that I've been given for the large limestone material and these reef heights, this is an actual calculated curve of the costs. And you can see that going from 10 to 20, you get a big drop in number of acres covered. But if you go from, as you increase the reef height, then your cost, what am I trying to say here? The number of acres that you can do for that cost goes down. So you hit this cost benefit kind of asymptote. I hope that makes sense. Wasn't just rambling. But anyway, so what we're trying to do is pick reef heights that we think might work. Now, this 30 centimeters is published literature, and but how low can we go to where we get the benefits, but we don't incur the costs? So this is one of our objectives, is to try and identify a reef height where we can get the benefits, but offset some of the costs. Hope that makes sense. And so obviously we don't have the resources to do everything. So these were our options, 15, 25, and 50 centimeters. The 25 is kind of just a little bit lower than that 30 to see if we can kind of get away with it, because it does incur less cost, or you get more acres per million with that decrease in height. Okay, I think I've beaten that horse to death. So another thing we're looking at is material size, and the hypothesis that the size and type will influence oyster recruitment, survival, and growth. But it was also, going beyond oyster demographics, looking at other ecosystem services. What we really want to do is, rather than just restore a reef for a fishery, is restore a reef for the ecosystem services that it provides and the ecological services like habitat provision. There's also interactions between the associated communities and the oysters that may benefit the oysters, like predation control, predator refuge, and just the services that a functioning ecosystem provides. So, and that will hypothetically be influenced by the material size and type that we choose. So we've got a number of options, small, medium, and large, which are very broad categories. So the small that we've sort of chosen was the 2 inches, the little lime rock that has been used across the bay. Our medium lime rock, which we were calling large. And then this large material, which FWC, which is 12 inches or 30 centimeters in diameter. This is the material that FWC are proposing to use for their restoration pilot project. So these were the 3 choices we have. So the limestone, it occurs naturally in Northwest Florida. We get ours from a mine in Perry, rather than the Kentucky lime rock that the other restoration efforts have used. It's relatively stable. It's quite dense. There's granite, which is also natural. It's not found locally. It's very heavy. It is stable, but it's more expensive because it's sold by the ton, and this is much more, it's marginally denser than limestone. It's a heavy material. And it's been used elsewhere, and it's had good results. And then there's concrete, and this is something that was brought up, why don't you use concrete? It's available, it's free, it's oysters will grow to it. So we considered concrete. Well, it's obviously it's not a natural substrate, but it has been used. It is readily available. Whether it's less expensive is questionable. It's marginally less expensive, but the problem with concrete is that you can't just take, bridge demolition material and chuck it out in the bay. It's got to be cleaned and crushed and sort of sanitized. And also something that came up at the last FWC meeting where we were discussing restoration, what I had never heard of before is floating concrete, which obviously you don't want your restoration materials to start floating away. So concrete is one of those sort of a little bit unknown, but it was an option that we considered. So what it came down to in considering all of these things, because we have rather limited resources, actually, just to put a kind of envelope on it, I suppose, or context, is that FWC has $17 million for their restoration effort. Their pilot project, they're going to be, NIFWIF is going to release about $4 million for their pilot project. Our budget is less than $200,000, probably considerably less, about $150,000, because we want to do multiple experiments, not just put all our proverbial eggs in one basket, so to speak. So we have to really scale down and be cognizant of cost. But we want to be scientifically rigorous. So we came up with 4 treatments, 5 replicates, which is 20 reefs, making these a little bit larger than last time because it was quite awkward for the oystermen to stay within that 10 by 10 meter space, especially with the currents and multiple boats going in there. They're very good at handling vessels and they did a really good job, but we're trying to make it a little less difficult for them and also to reduce the edge effects that we see, with very small patches. So 15 by 15, if I can go 20 by 20, that would be better, but this is the plan so far. Our reef height, slightly less than that 30 centimeter cutoff. See if we can get away with it. See if we can get the same response as we do higher. So 25 centimeters and then 50 centimeters, which is sort of double that. So we don't want overlapping treatments. We want them to be different enough that we'll hopefully see a separate treatment effect. So we're going 50 centimeters. Material size, since we've seen good response with that 6 to 8 inch medium material, which it seems to be doing well for us. It's also tongable, but not easily poachable. So that sort of stays in that kind of area where it's not going to get, hopefully, huge pushback from industry, which I suspect the 12-inch material will. So we are just testing whether this will give us as good a return as the larger material that FWC is planning to use. Now, comparison is a little bit apples to oranges because their sites are going to be bigger than ours, but I'm hoping that we can at least try and standardize our data to the point where we can actually compare those 2 materials. And also FWC is considering using the same size as we're using, so that will give us a crossover as well. Our material type, I've decided against concrete. Our limestone seems to work, and so I'd rather not confound our data by introducing another material. We want to have some cross-referencing between the sites that we already have at Peanut Ridge and the sites that we're planning to put on Cap Point. So we're going to stick with that lime rock as well. So I think that's my last slide. But before I take questions, I actually have a conundrum that I'd like to put to the group. So I had planned to put this restoration experiment out before the fall spat fall. And I've missed that window for a number of reasons. But my question is, my conundrum is, do I put the material out now before while the oysters are probably, well, they're not going to be spawning much at all until next fall, and risk the predators moving in and barnacles covering everything and sort of other things that might happen? Or do I leave this until next fall and miss this time window and try and plan it so that we catch the spring spat fall? Now, there are maybe benefits to having an ecosystem in place before the oysters come in. I just don't know the answer to this. And this brings up, like I said, another question, which is, do we time restoration according to what we think the animals are doing, or do we just put it out and let nature do her thing? So with that, I'll be quiet and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Do folks have input on Sandra's question regarding timing? It's a good one.
You can get back to me as well if you come up with some brilliant epiphany about it. I'm happy to hear it. I really don't know what to do.
Sandra, can you remind us? Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I think some of the conventional thinking is that, you know, you want to have the shell out there to as close to the spawning or the settlement as you can, just so that you have less competition initially for that vulnerable spat as far as for space. Because if you put it out there, a lot of times you can get a lot of the barnacles are going to set here and that sort of thing. So we've been trying to time it out to be right there, especially before the fall. You know, we were putting it in July, and you know, when you look at that, the seasonality of spat in that area, really that is dominant. That fall spat set is dominant from about September through the end of November. Yeah. And really,
that's what I was going for, but I missed it. Yeah. So you would leave it till the spring?
Yeah, I mean, I can. Yeah, that would be my thought. Only thing is, we've seen, you know, in the last couple of years, the spring spat set has not been very strong.
Right.
I can. Let me see. I just want to see if I can pull up our spat on shell numbers. I can share those.
Yeah,
if you want to see them.
How do I stop sharing my screen? Let me see.
Can you see that?
Yes.
So this is spat on shell, and this is for the east side. This is for central. And so, you know, you're really looking in this central area where we're looking at, you know, if you have it in even in July, you're going to catch. That's really the delay in that spring is even into June. You get a little bump, but really your bulk of spat are right here after, you know, after summer. So
okay, so October. Yeah, they're doing something construction wise. I apologize for the manic chainsaw sound. So it looks like October, if I can get it out before the end of October, it might be okay.
Yeah, you should be able to catch October and November spat in here.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Ryan. I'd really rather get it out if it makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, you know, especially with the small, relatively small, and you've got lots of oystermen that can help out. You might be able to get it out here pretty quick.
Thank you, Ryan. That's really helpful.
We're glad to share more, you know, resolution on the spat per shell we have. But really, what we found, you know, in the last few years is that spring spat set is really weak. It's almost like becoming a all summer and then a peak in fall.
Thanks, Ryan. Sandra, I have a question about the southern portion of south of Cap Point, Peanut Ridge area. You're mentioning the currents being faster there and maybe causing some of the materials to shift around. Have those currents changed over time in that area? Do you know? Are they faster now than they were historically?
Well, anecdotally, oh goodness. Can you hear me, or is that buzzing really distracting?
I can hear you fine. I don't hear any buzzing.
Okay. So what Shannon said was that when they took down the old bridge and put the new one up, that the old bridge was blocking some of that current. And so the current got worse when the new bridge was built because it's more open. But we don't have any data that, you know, supports that, just his experience, which I trust, but we don't have any data.
Interesting. Thank you. Other questions or comments for Sandra? It's a really exciting experiment, Sandra. I know we're all asking similar questions. I think we are in other regions. So interested to see what the results are. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you.